what's all this talk about feeling and imagination when we're talking about the faith and something that's firm and secure?
C.S. Lewis has influenced millions, but who influenced him? The answer may surprise you. Let's talk about it with Jeffrey Barbeau on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
Hey, we are so glad you're here. You always have a place at our table. And in case you're wondering, I'm Steve, the aforementioned old white guy. Matthew Porter is here. Matthew's writing a new version of the Screwtape Letters. We have debated whether I ought to say this one has a veteran homeowners association president writing to a younger homeowners association resident. It's called Screwtape Homeowners Letters or something like that.
We're working on the title.
Hey, are you surviving? Have they given their permission and they
We've made
love
some
you?
progress. I'll have to.
So it's all love and stuff.
Yeah, we got some stuff approved. So more news to come on the treehouse.
So I can stop praying for their death.
Well,
Okay.
I'll let you know when.
Our producer Jeremy is in the little glass booth. Jeremy's band plays classic rock, which I assume includes Del Vikings and Ricky Nelson.
That's the really classic, right?
Our one-man IT department, John Myers, is in the tech bunker. This week he had the presidential inauguration, or as John calls it, a factory reset. And speaking of presidents, Dr. George Bingham is the president of Key Life. Hail to the chief. We never inaugurated you.
Oh,
Yeah.
Wait a second.
Maybe we ought to have a service or
And so
something.
far, nobody's ever took a shot at me either.
And then Kathy Wyatt is the soft, feminine side of the program. Kathy is an avid swimmer. She says you should never swim without a friend who's a little slower than you are.
Yeah, it makes you look good.
Yeah, right. And I've explained to Dr. Barbeau that we are not academics, and if he doesn't keep the fodder down, we're not going to get this. And he has agreed. And I've never met him, but I met him today, and I noticed his beard, and he's cool. So this is going to be a great program. Jeffrey Barbeau is a theologian, literary critic, and historian. He serves as professor of theology at Wheaton College, the place where I almost went bankrupt sending our daughter. He has authored numerous monographs, anthologies, edited books. His latest book, which I hold in my nicotine-stained fingers, is The Last Romantic, C.S. Lewis, English Literature and Modern Theology. Now, before you go somewhere or touch the dial on your radio or your computer, this is going to be different than what you think, and you'll be glad you stayed, okay? This is your mother speaking. Don't touch the dial. Stay with us. Jeffrey, thanks for being with us. What is, you got to start. What is romanticism? I don't mean like kissing the girl, etc. What is it from a literature standpoint?
Well, I mean, if you want to keep this real, I think maybe we should be talking about romance like that. This has been going to air on Valentine's, though, I guess so. I should also say, since we both have this cover in our hands here, let me just point out, for those who are a little uncertain about the title, that's a poppy plant behind there. So that's opium.
You're going to get fired from Wheaton. You keep this up. All
and
right.
maybe that's a place to begin too, because when we think of the Romantic movement, we're often talking about poets, and in English, we're thinking about the British poets. And perhaps one of the most famous is Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was an opium addict. Wasn't that uncommon at that time? Maybe not quite the stigma we think of today, but it had some stigma. And the Romantic movement is pretty popular, I'd say. A lot of your listeners, I bet, maybe when they're in high school, heard or read some of the Romantic poems. Perhaps one of the most famous is Coleridge and his Rime of the Ancient Mariner, with the albatross around his neck
Yeah.
and how it, after he kills the albatross, it's hung around his neck and everybody dies. It's a pretty grisly scene, but a powerful poem. And so when we think of the Romantic movement, we're thinking of oftentimes poets like Coleridge, his friend Wordsworth, William Blake, maybe John Keats, and some others. But we're also thinking about a time period, and that's the late 18th century, early 19th century. And C.S. Lewis was an avid reader of this period. So the Romantic movement's pretty influential. People probably know it, even if they don't recognize it.
I was telling Jeffrey off the air that I subscribe to the C.S. Lewis Society, the New York C.S. Lewis Society Bulletin, and their present issue, which came yesterday, was on this subject: Romanticism. A lot of quotes from Wordsworth, Blake, and others, and the influence that it had on Lewis and the way they had agreed. You know, when one thinks of C.S. Lewis, one thinks rational, apologist, wins arguments, polemicist, that kind of thing. You don't generally think of Wordsworth. That sounds a bit controversial to me, is it?
It's kind of interesting because when the Wade Center, which is here in Wheaton, they asked me to give these lectures a couple of years ago, and I come to the study of C.S. Lewis in part as a student of the Romantic movement. And they said, well, we'd love to see you do something. And I went into it not too sure that C.S. Lewis himself had a whole lot to say about the Romantics. I figured maybe there'd be a few comments here and there. I knew of a few negative comments. So I was a little bit uncertain what I was getting myself into when I agreed to give these lectures, honestly. But sure enough, by the end of his life, I think Lewis recognized that the Romantics were some of the most important influences, and Wordsworth he named as one of the top 10 influences on his life.
That's him. That's it. They had a similar understanding of joy, and a place of disagreement too, didn't they?
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was saying, talk to us about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's interesting because one of the things we think of about the Romantic movement is this idea of the sort of inward life, right? The imagination, intuition, feeling. And I think that sometimes makes people feel a little bit uncertain about the movement, all right? I mean, what's all this talk about feeling and imagination when we're talking about the faith and something that's firm and secure? But this idea of joy maybe points the way, because joy is this deep longing for something beyond, right? And for Lewis, he recognized that that longing is something that all of us experience. And I think that's a pretty strong Romantic theme, that sense of the inward longing for something more. He wasn't exactly with the Romantics on it, but I could see, and I think you can find out in the book, how he's pulling on that and drawing us into that same idea.
Do you think, and I'm probably guilty of this, I'm a theological type, but I've found that truth propositions don't keep me warm at night, and there needs to be something more and far deeper, and I have a yearning for that. Is this what you're addressing in the book, that kind of thing?
I think so. When I talk to people at churches, when I go around and speak on different topics, or when I speak to my students and I say, well, why are you a Christian? Is it because you sat down and you thought about Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine and you sort of logically worked out the faith? Did you develop a firm argument about this or that? And most people don't say that that's what happened. Most people tell me that there was a time in their life when they had a deep need. Maybe things had gone really, really wrong. And that sense that they felt of forgiveness, of God's presence in their life, that's really what changed everything. So while there's good reason for those reflections, there's also a deep part of faith that I think is experiential, and it is exactly what Lewis is getting at.
And so on this program, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about exactly that. That sometimes the Christian faith can be quite dry. And as I said, propositions won't keep you warm at night. And when it really hurts and you've screwed up really bad, somebody's got to forgive you. And somebody's got to forgive you in an emotional, deep, and profound way. The book is called The Last Romantic. And just saying that at a theological seminary would cause some professors to wince. The subtitle doesn't help. C.S. Lewis, English Literature and Modern Theology. Guys, we're going to pursue this subject, and we're going to see something important about you and about me. We are not just brains. You got to get it into your heart sometimes. And maybe Dr. Barbeau will be able to tell us how to get it there. Don't go anywhere like Jesus. We're coming back. Thanks for being here. It's a high compliment that you would spend this hour with us. We're talking to Jeffrey Barbeau, and his new book is called The Last Romantic, C.S. Lewis, English Literature and Modern Theology.
Jeffrey, in preparing for the show, I was looking at, Romanticism. I'm like, I feel like I should know what that is. I'm not really that familiar. But then I read William Blake is kind of broadly included in that group. I had just gotten hip to him in the last year and reading through his stuff. And what's one line that jumped out to me? The narrow bud opens her beauties to the sun, and love runs in her thrilling veins. I'm reading that, and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna commit that. It's beautiful writing. It's beautiful stuff. So in that, is nature a part of Romanticism and kind of the broad themes of that? And did Lewis's Romanticism, is there any overlap between those?
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting you bring up Blake because a lot of your listeners, I bet if they have kids or they recall their own childhood, they were probably reading some of Blake's really fun, very simple sounding poetry. Things like the tiger, the lamb, and these are popular to put in children's books of poetry. And we often read them to our kids. We don't think much about it. But those natural images really kind of raise, for someone like William Blake, questions about God and the world, right? What is the sort of God who would make a tiger with all that ferocity, with all of that energy? And what sort of God makes a lamb and that gentleness and so forth? So a kid will hear that and maybe to just think, oh, this is just about the animals. But Blake actually was doing something a bit more.
Is there a danger of pantheism in this? I mean, you can move in that direction, can't you?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Wordsworth certainly sounds like it sometimes. I'll just pull out a brief couple lines here from Wordsworth's famous poem, Tintern Abbey, which is so beautiful. He says something like, "For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still, sad music of humanity." And he talks about in that poem this idea of sort of looking on nature and participating in it and almost sort of seeing God within nature. And I think Lewis was somewhat cautious about this. I'm happy to expand on it, but he gives his warnings even while he himself is attracted to it, I think.
Yeah, good.
Jeffrey, you alluded to the idea of story, the importance of story. Certainly, Scripture teaches us the value of story in Jesus, using parables and so forth. And, of course, C.S. Lewis, a lot of his most well-known writing had to do with story. I found it interesting that when someone gave you a set of the Chronicles of Narnia, after briefly starting into it, you sold it at a garage sale. So you may have come to the idea of, the importance of C.S. Lewis's story in this whole idea. Can you talk some about that?
It's interesting because so often if I tell my kids, like, hey, this is who God is, this is who Jesus is, what it means to be God's creation, at some point their eyes glaze over, they maybe start to fall asleep. If I've said this before, they might say, all right, Dad, we've heard it all before. But if I read them a story, they light up. They catch something. And maybe it doesn't say exactly the thing, but it gets close oftentimes. And I think Narnia does that really powerfully. It captures the imagination for children and for adults. And so story is such a powerful way to learn. It's not the only way, but it's certainly a powerful way.
And so that would be a gift of Romanticism in a sense, wouldn't it?
Well, that's right. I mean, if you go back to The Ancient Mariner that I mentioned before, how many people have told me over the years that when they read that poem, even though it's a poem and not maybe a fairy tale in that sense, that they read that poem maybe in high school or something, and the story of this mariner out on the ocean, killing a bird, having it hung around his neck, and people dying over this crime, just held them kind of in the grip of the story. And I think that's part of what the Romantic movement is doing. It's sort of pushing us down that road towards imagination.
Don't read that to your children before they go to sleep.
Jeffrey, I want to switch, because most of our conversation is going to be on this topic, but I want to switch over for just a second. As I was beginning to read through the book today, I came across, which I didn't have any idea about, that there seems to be some disagreement in the Christian community as to whether or not Lewis was really was in fact a theologian. Do you categorize him as a theologian, or where do you come down in that?
It's a difficult thing to say. Poor C.S. Lewis, right? I mean, he's done okay, it turns out. But there's a way in which theologians sort of look at him a little bit uncertain because he wasn't writing systematic theology the way a theologian probably ought to do it. And even literary scholars sometimes look at C.S. Lewis and they're not quite sure what to do because he's writing about Christianity and he's got these apologetic works and this science fiction stuff. And so I think actually in some ways Lewis suffers on both the literary side and the theological side from scholars. But anyone who reads him knows that there's some really deep stuff in there. And I think what we don't realize is that Lewis was, of course, a scholar of profound insight. He was very well read. He knew philosophy, theology, history, so much. And when he writes for a wide audience, he does so out of a deep understanding. So he is not technically a theologian, maybe as we'd expect, but there's no question that the theological insights he has, they're actually hitting the big marks of what's going on in his own day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's what this book is going to help us do. Maybe we need to do both. Maybe the idea behind the Christian faith is, of course, have the theological propositions or presuppositions, and at the same time, the heart and the story and the thing that can go places where the propositions won't go. I don't know if you'd agree with that or disagree with it, but maybe that's where we're called as Christians.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, we've got to be able to bridge the gap of different types of understanding and different modes of expression.
So good. You got to get this book. It's kind of slow because it's an academic lecture or lectures, but it's worth every minute. The Last Romantic, C.S. Lewis, English Literature, and Modern Theology. And we're talking to Jeffrey Barbeau, who wrote this book, but he didn't work hard at it because he had already done the lectures before the book came out.
Well played.
I don't want to disparage what you did. You did a good work in both places. Guys, we're coming back. Don't go anywhere. Hey, we're so glad you're here. We're hanging out with Jeffrey Barbeau. By the way, if you want to keep up with him, you can do it at Jeff Barbeau, and Barbeau is spelled BARBEAU.com, and on X at Jeff Barbeau.
Jeffrey, we kind of have asked questions around this, but specifically, if you are making the case to somebody who's new to this idea, what would you point to in Lewis's work to go, that's a clear, here's how this ladders to the Romantic movement and those influences?
Well, I think that's a great question, and there's a couple different directions we could go. First of all, I think it's worth saying that once you start to pay attention, looking for it, you can see references to the British Romantic poets and thinkers all over the place. He's constantly mentioning them, but in that way that C.S. Lewis does, he wears his learning lightly, so you don't ever feel like he's kind of hitting you over the head with it. He just drops these little nuggets in there. Just think of his great autobiography, A Conversion Narrative, Surprised by Joy. That's a great example where that is also the title of a Wordsworth poem. And it's such a beautiful poem, and it really gets at this idea of longing and memory, and so much is happening right there. And, when he wrote about it, someone said, well, isn't that a Wordsworth thing? He said, well, it's not really the point. And isn't that just like C.S. Lewis? He's sort of like, well, I'm not really this, or it's not really about that. But it's absolutely at work. He's got it everywhere. The second thing I'll say, and I think readers are going to really love this feature. It took a lot of extra work, so I want to make sure I say it to you. And that is, in the book, we have some images from his own personal library. And we have pictures of some of his books where Lewis has written marginal comments right at the bottom of the page, or the top of the page. Sometimes he would make his own index at the back of a book. And a lot of my work in this text is really based on sifting through hundreds of books that he had written in and just seeing kind of what's there. What did he write about? I mean, I don't know if anybody would ever want to read my scratchings. I seem to just be underlining randomly. But when Lewis does it, it's worth paying attention to. So if you buy the book, you'll see it right there on the page. There's some images from some of those markings he made.
That's awesome.
Would he would disagree at some points with the Romantics, wouldn't he? And then at other points, they would join hands and walk off in the sunset together. Are there places of disagreements?
Well, I think we could go back to that idea of nature for a moment. In one of his works, he talks about prayer, for example. And I know when I talk to a lot of Christians, and I think about, where do you feel closest to God? Again and again, my students, people in churches, they will say, when I go out into nature, when I go on a long walk, I live in the Chicago area. We've got some beautiful prairies. And how often do I go out into the prairie and I see just beauty all around me, and I feel this closeness to God. But Lewis warns us, if you go out into nature and you're hoping to get that experience, if that's what your eyes are on, is like nature to get some experience of God, he says you're going to miss it entirely. But
Huh.
rather, if you join into prayer in that context, then what will happen is it just all opens up together.
Oh, that's good stuff.
Hmm.
And that's a caution for every Christian, isn't it? I mean, we need to spend times that are quiet in the forest, among the flowers, and make that a place of prayer and bring them together. As Lewis says, do you think sometimes we're too sterile?
Well, I think we would certainly do well to recover every part of this world in our spiritual lives. But I think Lewis is not only concerned with nature, he is concerned about the church too. And so we need the liturgy, we need the experience of hearing sermons, of sharing in faith together, and we need those contexts when we maybe go out by ourselves or go out with other friends or family. And in both of those contexts, we can actually discover a lot of the profound, life-giving spirit, I think, of the Spirit of God right in those places. And that's a gift for us. I don't think it's something to be afraid of. I think it's
agree.
something that we can really just submit to the Lord, and it will be for good.
Is that your experience as, the preacher? Do you live it? Do you sometimes walk in the woods?
I'll tell you what, during COVID in particular, I found myself getting kind of antsy, feeling locked down, and my wife would say, "You got to get out of here." So it was in the dead of winter. It was freezing cold. I just bundled up and I started going on very long walks. It was just me and the deer and a fox running by. And I really found a sense of peace in that context. So I like to think I live it. I wish I could live it even more.
That's a good statement, and it's authentic.
It's amazing how they got those masks on the deer and the,
And the foxes too,
yeah,
especially
that's
on the
right.
foxes.
They're tricky.
Guys, we're going to continue this conversation on the other side of the break. You should continue with us on the other side of the break. Good things are yet to happen. The book is The Last Romantic, C.S. Lewis, English Literature and Modern Theology. And by the way, it's a very practical book in terms of our walk with Christ. You go sour and dry if it's just truth proposition, and you go maudlin if it's just the flowers. Put them together, and you got dynamite. Don't go anywhere. Hey, thanks for spending time with us. By the way, if you haven't yet subscribed to the weekly Key Life email, you're missing out. So while you're thinking about it, don't do it right now. Wait till this program is over, then you can do it. Go to keylife.org/subscribe, and you'll like it. And even if you don't like it, you won't complain because we're not going to charge you anything for it.
Indeed. Were you going to say something?
Well, we were talking off the air about the idea of the value of doing your own journaling and your own writing in the context of your relationship with the Lord and the growth there. Can you comment some on that?
I'd be happy to. It's interesting because Lewis himself was a little uncertain about what it meant to write his own biography too much. He was somewhat cautious about people interpreting his works on biographical basis. But That said, he was also a great letter writer, and he has journals that we still can look at and understand a lot of his own life from. Um, I think about journaling actually, and writing about your story. That really is something that thrives during the Romantic period. That late 18th century, early 19th century, we find people are really picking up on journaling and writing a kind of autobiography or a memoir, something that we take for granted today. Everybody should keep a journal, right? Everyone should tell their story. It seems like every time you turn around, another celebrity is writing their story. Someone's writing a memoir of some experience or other. And Lewis, I think, is certainly aware of this trend, and it really informs some of his work. Let me give an example here, since you asked about it, because I have to be cautious. It's sort of exciting, so I get rolling on it. Watch out. But let me tell you a story. A couple of years ago, I've been an on and off again journal writer over the years myself, but not consistent. And I was over in England, and I was reading Dorothy Wordsworth's journals. Now, Dorothy Wordsworth is the sister of William Wordsworth, one of the greatest poets in English literature. And her journals are gorgeous. I was reading these things like, I could do that. And so I pulled out a journal I just happened to have with me that was kind of open, blank pages. And I started writing. And at first I was just trying to write like she did, like observing all the flowers and the interesting things I saw when I was traveling around. But over time, I've developed my own voice. And I love to ask people whether they keep a journal or not. And I think if you are, you're actually picking up on some of that Romantic period heritage. If you're keeping a journal of your life and recording the things that happen and thinking about them, you're picking up on something that really emerges as a commonplace in the 18th century.
That's so good. And that really is what Romanticism is. It's being in touch with the world, isn't it? In not just an academic or propositional way, but in a heart way. And Lewis certainly does that. You can read his apologetics and go, yeah, I hadn't thought of that before. But you can read his stories and you can cry and laugh and rejoice. And maybe that's what Romanticism is, you think?
Well, that interior sense, that sense of our feelings and recognizing them. We think of Lewis, this Oxford, Cambridge guy, right? Kind of stuffy, maybe, even if you just think of a professor. But some of his writings are so profound. They move us, even when he's reflecting on his own life. Think of something like A Grief Observed, where he's thinking about death. And that's a really fascinating work because it actually is in the form of journals. And maybe that's a reminder of the ways that when we think about our lives and we start to process it out on paper, and I really encourage everybody to do this, to think about what's happening in your life by way of kind of writing it out, and then look back at it months later, years later maybe, and see what you've learned and grown in it over the time.
That's where we live. Our story is really important because that's where God speaks to us, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and what happens, I think, is when we discover a walk with Christ, we find that our story kind of just draws into the great story of history. I like to think of like my own struggles, my faith life, my journey as actually just a part of a much longer story. And I think in some ways we might say that that's what the Christian faith is when you start to recognize the pieces and parts of your life as a part of something much bigger. And one way to describe that is as a story of sorts. So that's certainly true.
So that's the gift of Romanticism.
Well, it's part of it. Absolutely. I mean, part of Romanticism is the sense of recognizing what's happening within us. It is imagining how to tell that story. It is perhaps developing stories about that. It is about being in touch with nature. It is imagination, right? There's so many facets to this that Romanticism can be a bit difficult to pin down. but that legacy is completely shaping Lewis. And it helps to remember it wasn't that much before his own life. Now, we might think, well, it's been 200 years. But for Lewis, when he's growing up, think of the 1920s, you're only 100 years out from that movement. So as a reader of literature, it's actually quite close for him.
If this program has been a surprise and different for listeners, and I suspect for all of us, there's something of that. Could you, if we were going to dip into the places the way Matthew did with Blake, could you give us a mini bibliography of 2 or 3 things that we don't have much time, but this might be a very helpful thing for you to do?
Well, I think it's worth saying that with the internet, everything is available these days, and there's lots of ways to learn. So let me just offer a couple thoughts. Today, we've focused and have seen kind of 3 poets have come up, and poetry can be difficult to read and appreciate. I get that. But actually, if you start to slow down, it helps. Number 1, I would just say, read it out loud. That's a good first step. But we've talked about 3, Blake, Coleridge, and Wordsworth. And all 3 of those are widely available online. And if you look up William Blake in the various websites out there, in particular, there's some archives that have the images, and I think you will just fall in love with it. With Wordsworth, if you just look up major Wordsworth poems, you will quickly discover a whole bunch to enjoy. Something like Tintern Abbey might be a beautiful example. Yeah. And with Coleridge, start with Rime of the Ancient Mariner and relive that journey with the mariner when he shoots the bird and that crime and all the devastation it causes. That's a good time.
Jeffrey, this has been so much fun, and you're a great guest, and I've learned so much. We all have. Thank you for writing the book, and I hope we can have you on again. But you do need to get a shave. I'm envious of your envious of your beard. Guys, we're going to come back in a little bit. We'll tell you who we're going to do it unto next week, so don't go anywhere. Discussion. I think sometimes we forget that the Christian faith isn't just the head stuff. In fact, it may be more of a heart thing than it is a head thing. And that's why, as Richard Pratt said in his book about God, he gave us stories. And there is a sense, and this is probably blasphemous for me to say this, but there's a sense in which God is a romantic. His love and his story do have that smell about it. And Jeffrey's comments were really good. And it really is funny that this same week I should come on the same subject about Romanticism and C.S. Lewis. And maybe it's something we all need to hear. Maybe we need to smell the flowers more and less of the coffee. Maybe we need to look at the birds, and maybe we need to be involved in nature, not to worship it, because it's a part of the created order. And because it's so pretty and so magnificent, it says something really important about the Creator. Maybe that makes me a romantic. Nobody's ever called me that before. Maybe that's what I am. Nah. But it's a nice thought. And so if we learned anything from Jeffrey, it is the importance of the flower, as long as you remember that it was God who created the flower. Kathy, who's going to be on next week?
Well, next week we had a recommendation from our friend Jonathan Feldstein back a couple of months ago that we should try to get his friend, whose name is Marzi Emirizadeh. She is Iranian. She was in prison over there. Her book is titled A Love Journey with God, From Pain to Love, Captivity to Freedom, Iran to the U.S. And she's involved in a ministry. She also works with Jonathan. If you remember, Jonathan talked about how they went over, a group of people went over and picked olives over in Israel
yeah,
and all that.
yeah.
Anyway, she's involved in all of that. But anyway, she's a believer, and she paid a very significant price for, quote, turning against the faith, that she was born into, et cetera. But anyway, so I think it's going to be a really, really interesting time with her.
Sounds good. If we can just learn how to pronounce her name.
I thought I did very
There's no way
well.
I can do that. I thought you did too. In fact, as I introduce her next week, I'm going to pause and you put her name in the blank spot.
Got it.
And that'll work. Hey, do join us next week. We're going to do it again. Between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't. And that gives you a wide berth.
Did Dave Sharp